reflection here, the witness talk at 2 o'clock. My name is Peter Vale. I'm a seminarian with the Archdiocese of New Orleans, and this is my adopted home parish. So I know many of you know me from various masses and events that I've been at here, and it's an honor to be here with you offering this reflection. When we think of heroes in our lives, especially for younger people, they might think of Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, things like that. In the political arena, we have giants like George Bush, who just passed, Martin Luther King. But in the spiritual realm, we also have giants and heroes. And for me, the biggest hero is Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk. He died in 1968. He had sort of a checkered past before he entered the monastery. He was a writer and engaged in all sorts of revelry and things like that, but he felt this call to enter into the silence of the monastery, and he lived out that life as a faithful monk until his tragic death in 1968. He left behind a huge library of works, millions and millions of words written, and for me, those have been treasures of inspiration. And so I thought today I would offer his most common prayer and then some reflections within that prayer based off of other writings of his. This prayer is taken from Thoughts in Solitude. You've probably heard it before. You might not have known it was Thomas Merton that wrote it. And I think it speaks to everyone's heart in terms of its raw emotion and the yearnings and desires and uncertainties and insecurities that we all have in life. So I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then I'll expand on 3 parts that I identify within it. It begins, "My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think that I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope that I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone." I actually pray this prayer after Mass every single day. It speaks to me, and hopefully it speaks to you as well. There are 3 things contained within it that I'd like to offer for reflection, giving some examples from my own life. The first is this whole idea of being our true selves. Now, turning to his classic work, this came out in 1948, The 7-Story Mountain was really the work that put Thomas Merton on the literary scene. It was a huge success, and it's a spiritual autobiography that he wrote. And he has these words to say within that autobiography. "The logic of worldly success rests on a fallacy. The strange error that our perfection depends on the thoughts and opinions and applause of other men. A weird life it is indeed, to be living always in someone else's imagination, as if that were the only place in which one could at last become real." For me personally, growing up, I had the opportunity to go to a really good high school in New England, a competitive school, a college prep school, and I did really well there. I applied myself and I enjoyed it. When it came time to apply to colleges, the thought of seminary was on my mind in a way that I couldn't ignore, and I had always thought about being a priest ever since I was 8 or 9 years old. And I remember having a discussion with my spiritual director. He was the chaplain of the high school, and asking him where I should apply and what I should do. I had gone to several come and see weekends at the seminary there in Boston, and so I was very attracted to that. And when applications came around, I remember telling the guidance counselor, I'm going to apply to Harvard, and if I don't get in, I'm going to go to seminary. So I applied early, and I got in. And I remember having a discussion with my spiritual director, what do I do now? And his words to me were, "You can't say no to Harvard." And I didn't. And it was hard for me, and I remember all the way up until graduation and the speech I had to give there, considering breaking it to my family and friends that I was going to turn that down to go to seminary, but I didn't have the guts. And I went to Harvard, and it was very good years. It was very formative years that I look back on now in seminary formation and value. But there was pressures. My family saw me pursuing certain paths, friends, even opportunities that presented themselves. But in the back of my mind, I wanted to either be a priest or a teacher. Things that aren't really that lucrative or admirable by the world's standards. But it was so there was an unrest within me that I had to struggle with, and I feel like Merton here captures that, living in the imaginations and the thoughts of other people as though that's where you can only be real. And so I feel like the wisdom there is trying to see who God made us, what it is He's calling us to do, and to follow that path despite all of the other things around us. The second nugget that I'm pulling out of this prayer has to do with discovering God's will for us. So this is a natural extension of what I had just mentioned. And I'm taking this quote from, it's a book that Merton put out in the 50s called "No Man is an Island." And this is what he has to say about that. "If we are too eager to have everything, we will almost certainly miss even the one thing we need. Happiness consists in finding out precisely what the one thing may be in our lives, and in gladly relinquishing all the rest. For then, by a divine paradox, we find that everything else is given us together with the one thing we needed." That speaks to me in my own life in a particular way, and it's nothing profound, and it has to do with what we're experiencing now, that sacred silence. For me, God speaks to me in my gut when I allow for all of the craziness of the world to just calm down. And it's moments like this, especially before His Eucharistic presence, that I find God moves me and reveals His will for me. And that happiness, I think, is God's way of telling us that we're on the right path. If you look at the conscience as something that when we do something bad, we have this thing called guilt, which is God's way. It's built into every single person of letting us know that we're not on the right path. And so the opposite of that, I believe, are those feelings of happiness and true, deep, lasting joy that come when we do feel like we're on the right path. And I feel like in order to fully assess that, we need to allow for moments of silence, to turn off everything, sit ideally before the Lord, and to see what's stirring within our gut, within our person. Last thing I'd like to talk about from this prayer is God's unfailing presence. This is what Merton had to say. This isn't from a book. It's actually from his final address he gave as a novice master back in 1965. The abbot appointed him to look after the men that were coming into the monastery and to help form them in what's called a novitiate. And this is what he had to say to them. "Life is this simple. We are living in a world that is absolutely transparent, and the divine is shining through it all the time. This is not just a nice story or a fable. It is true." For me, God's unfailing presence and the craziness of life, some of the hardest moments of life, and we know life is messy. One of the things that I'm taking on now at the seminary is prison ministry, and I was actually there yesterday as kind of the head of the ministry for the seminary. It's me and two other people. We were at the jail downtown. And I remember leaving, and I got my first formal tour of the seminary, and I got to go in all of the blocks, and even the psychiatric wards and things like that. And it weighs on you, just asking, is there really a God out there? How can this exist? How can this be, if God's really there? And for me, it's important in moments like those, again, to come back to the Eucharist, to God's presence, to that silence. And I also find God shining through in a particular way, being from Florida, originally from Boston, but most recently from Florida, nature and the beach, and and the woods and things like that. For me, that's where I really encounter God and his presence shining through into this world. And so I challenge us to find those ways in which God speaks to us, and it's done differently for all sorts of people, and to really figure out what God is trying to convey in those moments, especially in the season of Advent. Right? There are three comings we talk about. One is Jesus' birth in history, right? One is his coming at the end of time, and then the third one is his coming into our hearts now, right? And that should happen on an everyday occurrence, and it's important for us to figure out what it is that the Lord is trying to convey to us today. I'd like to end by reading that prayer again, and hopefully it offered you little words of wisdom. If you're interested in exploring more of Merton, there's plenty out there, and again, he's been a spiritual hero for me. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself, and the fact that I think that I am following your will does not mean I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death, and I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Thank you.